Okay. Given the wide range that we have there, could you explain to us, like, for example, Harvard University has, they're up in the 60s or so for their rate of, is that correct? And so now and Harvard University probably has one of the largest endowments in the country, would that be correct? You all agree? That would be, okay. So what I'm looking at, some place like George Mason, and I understand a lot of the universities don't want to have caps here. What I'm trying to look at is how, when we have a university with a huge endowment, probably one of the largest in the country, has one of the highest rates, how can we provide for fairness, particularly for the new and up-and-coming universities? We want to have more diversity in terms of ability to get the research out there. And I think, Dr. Vedder, you've provided some different ideas on that. And then I also, and this is sort of for all of you to address maybe in a general idea, but when you look at, I'm thinking like at George Mason, I know the Gates Foundation is funding some of the research that we have going on, I believe, in Lyme disease. The state also funds it. I'm not sure what their rate is that they allow. And then we have some federal government money going in there. How does that work when the Gates Foundation does cap their administrative costs at 10%? How does this all work out when you have those different rates? And how can we as a federal government maybe get a better bang for the buck in getting the money going directly to research among the different situations in different universities? Yes.
Could I respond to that question? Yeah. Thank you. So I think there were three questions, one about the endowment, one about why do rates vary, and one about foundations. So the endowment piece, I'm not an expert on endowment, but there's certain restrictions about how you can use the funds for endowment. Mm-hmm. But if I could address the other two, because I think they're kind of at the heart of the issue as we look at this. And I would suggest that rates vary significantly, as we all have discussed, for two primary reasons. One, because of geography, what region they're in. If you have the exact same research building in San Francisco or New York City, or in the middle of America, that exact same research, the cost of that, the cost of construction, utilities, and everything else are going to be vastly different. But the second point I think is more important there, and that is it's all about the type of research. Within Duke, if we looked at individual grants, we have research being done on public policy, and the F&A related to that individual grant is a computer, the lights, and so forth. If we look at a School of Medicine, they have biocontainment facilities. They have specialized HVAC. They have warm rooms and cool rooms. They have purified water. They have the ability to filter the water for the experiments in a certain way. They have IT infrastructure. I mean, it truly is all about the research, the type of research being done. And I would suggest, again, we see, within Duke, we might see one grant where the effective rate is low. We might see another grant where it's really 100% or more. That averages out across the institution in this process. And then with regard to foundations, I think there's a couple of things to look at. We have a fair amount of foundation money. A fair amount of that is from the Gates Foundation. But the way we cost is vastly different from a foundation to the federal government. First of all, foundations, and it's on the Gates Foundation website, for example, they will routinely pay certain things that the federal government will not pay. They pay it directly. Project management costs, facilities costs, lots of different things that the federal government would not pay. The second thing is that foundations generally apply their F&A rate on total direct costs. There was some discussion before about modified total direct costs. The federal government does not pay overhead to Duke University on capital equipment, patient care, subawards, lots of different categories. Oftentimes a foundation does. And then continuing, many of the foundation funding relates to off-campus work. So comparing the Gates Foundation at 10% to Harvard at 60, it's more appropriate to compare it to the off-campus rate, which is normally around 25, 26, 27%. And then lastly, I would say, you know, foundations, at least our experience at Duke, are oftentimes incremental funding. We have, again, a fair amount of Gates Foundation funding that is providing funding related to development of an AIDS vaccine. NIAID is providing the bulk of that funding. The Gates Foundation is providing critical funding to support that.
Okay, and Dr. Vedder, did you want to?
Well,
right.
As Mr. Luther mentioned, there were several components to your question. One point you made with regards to endowments, and it is, I think you're raising a fairly legitimate question, and also about the overall issue of sort of inequality in the funding. I did do a little statistical regression equation looking at the published NSF overhead rates as of 2 or 3 years ago for about 100 different schools, and I compared that with other indicators of the eliteness of the school, including their endowment money per student. And it was interesting that the richer schools were getting the higher percentage rates. Now, it is true, as Mr. Luther says, that there are special circumstances in some situations that might lead to some legitimacy in the differences of cost. But my university, a little school in Appalachia with a modest endowment, has an overhead rate of about 50%. In 2013, Harvard had 69%. And it is literally true. If you walk into a building in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the floors are marble. I mean, they're nicer buildings. I mean, what the hell? I've been teaching in universities 52 years, and I've taught at all the universities mentioned here. I have 2 degrees from Illinois. I have 1 degree. I get a lot of money from George Mason from the University of Colorado. I've been at all these schools. And believe it or not, there are differences in the appearances. So I think it would be wise to ask the GAO to extend their studies further. What does Britain do? Take another country. What does Canada do? Why would McGill University or the University of Toronto be much different than American universities? What do the Canadians do? I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. To me, a large part of the costs are this back and forth negotiations. Why not just set a flat rate and say, be done with it?
And save the money on the audits.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't want my remarks to be construed as saying I am against scientific funding. It's a question, how do we divide the pie between the researchers and between the administrative costs?
Thank you. Thank you. And I've gone over my time, so I now recognize Mr. Lipinski. 5 minutes.